I stepped out of the meeting with the Japanese investors at 6:30, exhausted but satisfied. $4.3 million. The contract was signed, the champagne toasted, the bows exchanged. Another victory in a career built on victories. I told Marcus, my driver, I'd walk to the car instead of having him pull around front. I needed the air, needed to process the win alone like I always do. 23 years building my consulting firm from nothing, and I still get that rush when a deal closes. Some things never change. The November air in Lower Manhattan was crisp, that perfect temperature where you don't need to button your coat all the way. I adjusted my Hermes bag on my shoulder and started toward the parking garage 3 blocks away. The streets were busy with the dinner crowd, people laughing outside restaurants, couples holding hands. I barely noticed them. My mind was already on tomorrow's presentation to the board. That's when I saw him. At first, I didn't recognize the man hunched over behind the Italian restaurant on 47th Street. He was digging through a trash bag, pulling out what looked like leftover pasta, eating it right there on the sidewalk without even looking at what he was putting in his mouth. Just another homeless person in a city full of them. I would have walked past like I always do, maybe felt that brief pang of guilt that successful people feel, maybe not. But something about the angle of his shoulders stopped me cold. I knew those shoulders. I'd traced them with my fingers for 22 years. I'd rested my head against them when Sophia was born, when Ethan took his first steps, when my father died. Those shoulders had held me through every major moment of my life, until they didn't anymore. Thomas. My brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It couldn't be him. It had been 8 years since the divorce, 8 years since I'd signed those papers and walked away from a marriage that was drowning us both. 8 years of building a new life with Marcus, my second husband. 8 years of telling myself I'd made the right choice, the necessary choice, the only choice. But it was him. I knew it with absolute certainty, even though the man in front of me looked nothing like the Thomas I'd divorced. That Thomas had been broken, yes, defeated by depression and unemployment, but he'd still been clean, still been housed, still been human in a way that this man crouched over garbage didn't look. His hair was long and matted, more gray than the brown I remembered. His beard was unkempt, dirty. His clothes hung off a frame that had lost at least 40 pounds. He was wearing a jacket that was torn at the shoulder, pants that were stained with God knows what. His hands, those beautiful architect's hands that used to sketch buildings that made people cry, were filthy and shaking as he shoved spoiled food into his mouth. I stood there frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. My $12,000 handbag suddenly felt obscene. My tailored Armani suit felt like a costume. Everything I'd built, everything I'd become, felt like a lie standing 10 feet away from the man I'd promised to love, in sickness and in health. He must have sensed someone watching because he looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. I watched recognition dawn in his eyes, watched something flicker across his face. But it wasn't anger like I expected. It wasn't hatred or resentment or even surprise. It was something so much worse. It was relief. "Victoria," he said. His voice was hoarse, rougher than I remembered, but it was still his voice. Still the voice that had whispered, "I do," 30 years ago, that had sung lullabies to our babies, that had begged me not to leave during our last fight. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. I just stood there staring at him while people walked past us, oblivious to the fact that my entire world was collapsing on a dirty Manhattan sidewalk. Thomas slowly stood up, still holding the bag of garbage. He looked at me with those blue eyes that used to light up when I walked into a room, eyes that were now hollow and tired and infinitely sad. "I tried to save you," he said quietly. "I tried so hard to save you." That's when I started crying. Not delicate tears, but ugly, choking sobs that made people turn and stare. I didn't care. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stand there and cry while my ex-husband, the father of my children, the man I'd loved more than anything before I'd convinced myself that love wasn't enough, watched me with an expression that looked almost like pity. "Save me?" I finally managed to choke out. "Thomas, what happened to you? How did you end up here?" He looked down at the garbage bag in his hands, then back at me. "Your sister," he said simply. "Your sister happened." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Diane? What does Diane have to do with this? Everything, he said. His voice was flat, empty. She has to do with everything. But you wouldn't know that, would you? You never wanted to know what happened after you left. The accusation stung because it was true. After the divorce, I'd blocked Thomas from my life completely. Refused to hear updates about him from the kids. Refused to ask Diane how he was doing when she said she was helping him get back on his feet. I'd told myself it was self-preservation, that I needed clean boundaries to heal. But standing there looking at him, I realized it had been cowardice. I hadn't wanted to face what I'd done, what I'd left behind. I need to know, I said, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I need to know what happened. Please. Thomas laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. Now you want to know? After 8 years of silence, now you're curious? Yes. My voice came out stronger than I felt. Yes, I want to know. I need to understand how you went from our divorce to this. I gestured at him, at the trash bag, at everything he'd become. He studied me for a long moment. I could see him deciding whether to tell me, whether I deserved the truth. Finally, he sighed and dropped the garbage bag back onto the ground. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here, he said. They know me there. They let me use the bathroom to wash up sometimes. I can't go into your fancy places looking like this, but this place is okay. If you really want to know, meet me there in 20 minutes. But Victoria, I'm warning you now. Once you hear what I have to say, you can't unhear it. And I don't think you're going to like what it means about the life you've built. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a slow shuffle that broke my heart even more than everything else combined. I watched him disappear around the corner, then pulled out my phone with shaking hands. I should have called Marcus. I should have called my therapist. I should have called anyone who would talk me out of what I was about to do. Instead, I texted Marcus that something had come up and I'd get a car home myself. Then I called my assistant and canceled my dinner with a potential client. Then I just stood there on that sidewalk, staring at the garbage bag Thomas had been eating from, trying to process the impossible reality that my ex-husband was homeless and starving, and somehow my sister was involved. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to walk away, to get in my car and go home to my penthouse apartment and my second husband and my carefully constructed life, and forget I'd ever seen Thomas on that street. 8 years of therapy, 8 years of building walls around the guilt and pain of that divorce, and one chance encounter was threatening to tear it all down. But I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after seeing him like that. Not after he'd looked at me and said he'd tried to save me. Save me from what? I started walking toward the coffee shop he'd mentioned. My heels clicked against the pavement, that sound of success and power that I'd always loved. Now it just sounded hollow. Everything felt hollow. The designer clothes, the expensive bag, the business victories I'd been so proud of 20 minutes ago. What did any of it matter if Thomas was eating from trash cans while I closed million-dollar deals? The coffee shop was exactly the kind of place I never went to anymore. Small, cramped, with mismatched furniture and a chipped counter. The smell of burnt coffee and something fried hit me as soon as I walked in. A few people looked up at me, clearly out of place in my business suit, then went back to their phones and newspapers. I ordered a black coffee I didn't want, and sat down at a table near the back, positioning myself so I could see the door. 15 minutes later, Thomas walked in. He'd obviously done his best to clean up in whatever bathroom he'd found. His face was scrubbed, his hair was wet and pushed back from his forehead. He was still wearing the same torn jacket and stained pants, but his hands were clean. He got a cup of coffee that the cashier gave him with a familiar nod, like this was a regular occurrence, then came to sit across from me. Up close, he looked even worse than he had on the street. His cheeks were hollow. His skin had that grayish tint that comes from malnutrition and sleeping rough. There were scars on his face I didn't remember, and his eyes had that wariness that comes from spending too much time being vulnerable on the streets. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Tell me," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Tell me everything. Start from the divorce and don't leave anything out." Thomas took a long sip of his coffee, staring past me at something only he could see. When he finally started talking, his voice was distant, like he was recounting someone else's life instead of his own. When you left, I was already at rock bottom. You know that. The depression, the unemployment, feeling like a failure as a husband and father. The divorce just confirmed what I already believed about myself, that I was worthless, that I'd destroyed the only good thing in my life through my own weakness. I started to interrupt, to say that wasn't true, but he held up his hand. Let me finish. You wanted to know, so let me tell it. Your sister Diane showed up at my apartment 2 weeks after you filed the papers. She brought food, said she was worried about me, said she wanted to make sure I was okay. I thought it was kind. I thought she was being a good person, looking out for her ex-brother-in-law. I was so desperate for someone to care that I didn't question it. He took another sip of coffee, and I could see his hands shaking slightly. She started visiting regularly, once a week at first, then more. She'd bring groceries, sometimes money. She'd sit and listen to me talk for hours about how much I missed you, missed the kids, missed my old life, and she'd nod sympathetically and tell me she understood, that she'd always felt like she lived in your shadow, that she knew what it was like to feel like a failure compared to perfect Victoria. The way he said my name made me flinch. There was no affection in it, no warmth, just a flat statement of fact. I didn't realize what she was doing at first, how she was slowly, carefully poisoning every thought I had about you. She'd say things like, Victoria always needed to be in control, didn't she? Or, I remember how she'd get frustrated when you couldn't keep up with her career. Little comments that seemed supportive but were actually planting seeds, making me believe that you'd never really loved me, that our marriage had been about you having someone to control, to feel superior to. I felt sick. That's not true. That was never true. I know that now, Thomas said, and there was something like compassion in his voice. But back then, I believed it, because Diane was so good at it, Victoria. She knew exactly what to say, exactly how to frame things to make me doubt every good memory I had of us. And I was so broken, so desperate to make sense of why my life had fallen apart, that I bought every word. Thomas paused, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. I could see him gathering strength to continue, and part of me wanted to stop him. Part of me wanted to walk out of that coffee shop and pretend this conversation had never happened. But I stayed frozen in my seat, waiting for the rest of the story that would dismantle everything I thought I knew about the last 8 years. I need you to understand what our marriage was like before it fell apart, he said finally, because I think you've rewritten it in your head the same way I did. We were good together, Victoria. Really good. Do you remember that? I did remember. God, I remembered everything. We'd met when I was 26, a junior analyst at a small consulting firm that was about to expand. Thomas had been hired to redesign the office space, and I'd been assigned to work with him on the project. He was 28, full of passion about creating spaces that enhanced human connection rather than just efficient workflow. I thought he was impractical and idealistic. He thought I was cold and calculating. We argued constantly during those 3 months of renovation. I remember, I said softly. I remember falling in love with you during those arguments about whether the break room needed windows. A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. You said windows were a waste of valuable wall space. I said humans need natural light to thrive. We compromised with skylights. And you were right, I admitted. That break room became everyone's favorite space in the office. We were a good team, Thomas continued. You had the drive and business sense. I had the creativity and vision. When we got married 6 months later, everyone said we were crazy moving too fast. But it worked. We balanced each other. He was right. For years, we'd been perfectly balanced. I'd climbed the corporate ladder while he built his reputation as an innovative architect. We'd bought a brownstone in Brooklyn that Thomas had lovingly restored himself. Sophia was born when I was 30, Ethan 3 years later. I'd taken minimal maternity leave both times, driven to prove that motherhood wouldn't slow my career. Thomas had been the one to do school drop-offs, to attend parent-teacher conferences, to be present in ways my ambition didn't allow. You were always there for the kids, I said. I was the one who missed things, recitals, games, school events. I was always working. You were building something, Thomas said, but there was no judgment in his voice, just stating facts. And I supported that. I believed in what you were doing. I was proud of you, Victoria. Even when you made partner and started traveling constantly, even when you barely made it home for dinner 3 nights a week, I was proud. I never resented your success. Then what happened? I asked, though I already knew the answer. When did it all start falling apart? 2008, Thomas said immediately. The recession. My firm downsized, and I was one of the first to go. Not because I wasn't talented, but because I was expensive, and they needed to cut costs. I was 48 years old, at the peak of my career, and suddenly I was unemployed. I remembered that phone call. I'd been in a meeting with clients in Chicago when Thomas called to tell me he'd been let go. I'd said all the right things, told him we'd figure it out, that his talent would get him another job quickly. But underneath the supportive words, I'd felt a spike of panic. We'd just refinanced the brownstone. Sophia was in her junior year at Columbia. Ethan was in private high school. We had expenses, obligations, a lifestyle we'd built together. I tried to find another position, Thomas continued. For months, I sent out resumes, went to interviews, networked with everyone I knew. But the market was flooded with experienced architects, all competing for the few jobs available. I got close a few times, made it to final rounds, but someone younger or cheaper always got picked. After 6 months, I stopped getting interviews at all. The rejections started feeling personal. Like the world was confirming what I'd always secretly feared about myself, that you weren't good enough, I said quietly. Exactly. Thomas's eyes met mine, and I saw the pain there, still raw after all these years. And that's when the depression really took hold. Not just sadness about being unemployed, but this deep, crushing certainty that I was fundamentally flawed, that everything I'd accomplished in my career had been luck, and now that luck had run out, and everyone could see what a fraud I really was. I'd watched him sink into that depression in real time, but I hadn't understood it. I'd tried to be supportive at first, encouraging him to keep trying, to stay positive. But as months turned into a year, then 2 years, my patience had worn thin. I'd been working twice as hard to cover our expenses, pulling in extra clients, saying yes to every project. I'd been exhausted and resentful, coming home to a husband who spent most of his time in his home office, staring at blank computer screens or sleeping until afternoon. I took over everything, I said, the memory making me feel sick. The finances, the decisions, all of it. I told myself I was helping, being supportive. But really, I was just taking control because I couldn't stand watching you do nothing. You were drowning too, Thomas said, and there was understanding in his voice that I didn't deserve. You were holding everything together by yourself. I know how hard that must have been. I just couldn't see it at the time. All I could see was that you were succeeding where I'd failed, that you were strong where I was weak, that you didn't need me anymore. I did need you, I said, my voice breaking. I needed my husband back. I needed my partner. But I didn't know how to reach you through the depression. I suggested therapy so many times, and I refused every time, Thomas admitted, because admitting I needed therapy felt like admitting I was broken beyond repair. I know how irrational that sounds now, but mental illness isn't rational. It twists everything, makes you believe things that aren't true. I genuinely believed that I was protecting you and the kids from my failure by keeping my distance, that if I just tried harder, I could fix myself without help. I remembered the fights we'd had about therapy, me begging him to see someone, him insisting he just needed time, that he'd pull himself out of it eventually. I'd tried being gentle, then firm, then angry. Nothing had worked, and with every refused session, every missed job interview, every day he spent in bed instead of engaging with life, I'd felt the distance between us growing. When did you decide to leave me? Thomas asked. There was no accusation in the question, just curiosity. I thought back to that moment. It hadn't been one dramatic event, but rather a gradual realization that had crystallized into certainty. It was Ethan's high school graduation, I said finally. 3 years into your unemployment. You came to the ceremony, but you barely spoke to anyone. You stood in the corner looking miserable while I made small talk with the other parents. And I remember thinking that I couldn't do this anymore, that I'd spent 3 years trying to hold our family together by myself, and I was exhausted, that maybe we'd both be better off apart. I remember that day, Thomas said quietly. I wanted to be present for Ethan. I tried so hard to engage, to be the father he deserved. But the depression was like this heavy weight on my chest, making everything feel impossible. I saw you across the room, so elegant and confident, laughing with people I couldn't even make eye contact with, and I thought you'd be so much better off without me dragging you down. So we were both thinking the same thing, I said. But you were the one brave enough to actually do it, Thomas replied. You filed for divorce 6 weeks after Ethan's graduation, July 2016. I remember the date because it was also the date I stopped believing I had any value as a human being. I closed my eyes against the pain of that memory. I'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in my head, trying to find the gentlest way to tell my husband of 22 years that I was leaving. In the end, there was no gentle way. I'd sat him down in our living room, the one he'd designed with those beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light, and I'd told him I wanted a divorce, that I still loved him, but I couldn't keep living like this, that we were destroying each other and it needed to end. He hadn't argued, hadn't tried to change my mind. He'd just nodded slowly and said, "You're right. You deserve better than this." Then he'd gone upstairs to the bedroom we'd shared for 2 decades and closed the door. I'd heard him crying through the walls, but I hadn't gone to him. I'd told myself it would only make things harder. Diane showed up the next day, I said, remembering. She'd somehow heard about the divorce already. She told me I was doing the right thing, that I needed to put myself first. She offered to help with the kids, to be there for support. I was grateful. I thought she was being a good sister. Thomas's expression hardened. She showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later with completely different messages, telling me how devastated she was about our divorce, how she couldn't believe you were giving up on our marriage, how she'd always admired what we had together. She told me she supported my decision to leave, I said slowly, pieces starting to click together. She said you'd been taking advantage of my success, that you'd gotten comfortable letting me carry everything. And she told me you'd always been controlling, Thomas said. That you'd married me because you liked having someone to manage, someone who made you feel superior. She was telling us both exactly what we needed to hear to justify the divorce and hate each other. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the realization of how thoroughly Diane had manipulated us. My sister, who I'd trusted completely, who I'd believed was supporting me through the hardest time of my life. I should have questioned it, I said. I should have wondered why she was so involved, so eager to insert herself into the situation. We were both vulnerable, Thomas said. That's when manipulators strike, when you're too broken to see what they're really doing. Thomas signaled the waitress for another coffee. She brought it over with that same familiar nod, and I realized he must come here often enough that they knew his routine. The thought made my stomach turn. How long had he been homeless? How many days had he spent seeking out places like this, small kindnesses from strangers who didn't even know his name? After the divorce was finalized, Thomas continued, Diane became my lifeline. That's how it felt at the time. She'd visit twice a week, always bringing groceries or small amounts of cash. $50 here, $100 there. She said she wanted to help me get back on my feet. That family takes care of family. I was living in a studio apartment in Queens, barely making rent from the settlement money. You were generous with the divorce, I'll give you that. I gave you half of everything, I said. It seemed fair. The brownstone, the savings, everything we'd built together. You got over $600,000. Thomas's laugh was bitter. I got $340,000 after legal fees and paying off some debts you didn't know about. Credit cards I'd maxed out trying to keep up appearances during the unemployment. I was too ashamed to tell you. I felt that familiar guilt rise up again. How had I not known? How had I been so blind to how bad things had gotten for him? The money should have been enough to start over, I said. To get an apartment, maybe start a small business. $300,000 is a significant amount. It would have been, Thomas agreed, if Diane hadn't convinced me to invest it. My blood ran cold. What do you mean, invest it? She had this business opportunity, a marketing startup that needed capital. She showed me the prospectus, the projected returns. 20% annually, she said. It seemed legitimate. She was putting her own money in too, she told me. And I trusted her. She was your sister. She'd been so kind to me. Why would she lie? Oh, God, I whispered. Thomas, please tell me you didn't give her everything. Not at first, he said. I gave her $100,000 to start. She said we needed to meet the minimum investment threshold to get the best returns. I kept the rest in savings, told myself I was being smart by diversifying. The first quarter, she showed me statements proving I'd made $8,000. I was thrilled. It felt like the first thing that had gone right in years. I could see where this was going, and I felt sick. She faked the statements. I didn't know that at the time, Thomas said. I thought I'd finally made a good decision. So when she came back 6 months later and said the company was expanding, that they needed more capital, and early investors would get preferred shares, I gave her another $100,000. Then the rest, a few months after that. By the end of 2017, she had all of it. Every penny of the divorce settlement. Did you ever see any of it again? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No. Thomas's voice was flat. The company didn't exist, or if it did, my money never actually went into it. I found out later that Diane had a gambling problem. Had for years, apparently. She'd racked up debts with some serious people, and my $340,000 paid them off. She used me, Victoria. She used my trust and my desperation and my gratitude to steal everything I had left. I couldn't speak. My sister, my own sister, had done this, had systematically destroyed a man who was already broken, who was already drowning. And she'd done it while pretending to care about him, while positioning herself as his savior. When did you realize? I managed to ask. Late 2018, about 2 years after the divorce. I'd been asking Diane about withdrawing some of the returns because my rent was going up and I was running out of money. She kept telling me the funds were locked in, that early withdrawal would cost me penalties. Finally, I insisted. I needed the money desperately. That's when she broke down and admitted the truth. Thomas's hands were shaking again. He set down his coffee cup before he spilled it. She cried, he said, and there was still disbelief in his voice. She actually cried and told me she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd been trying to help me by investing the money, but the company had been fraudulent, that she'd been scammed too. She said she'd lost her own investments as well. She begged me not to report it to the police because it would destroy her reputation, her business. She promised she'd pay me back eventually, that she just needed time. And you believed her, I said. What choice did I have? Thomas asked. Reporting her meant involving you, meant the kids finding out their aunt was a thief. It meant accepting that I'd been stupid enough to give all my money to someone without proper documentation. It meant admitting I'd lost everything again. So yes, I believed her. Or I pretended to believe her, because the alternative was too devastating. I thought about that time period in my own life. Late 2018, I'd been settling into my marriage with Marcus. We'd gotten married that summer, a small ceremony at his estate in Connecticut. I'd been happy, or at least I'd convinced myself I was happy. Marcus was successful, stable, emotionally available in ways Thomas never had been. We made sense together. Two high achievers building a life based on mutual respect and shared goals. And while I was building that new life, Thomas was losing everything because of my sister. I tried to recover, Thomas continued. Even without money, I thought I could start over. I updated my portfolio, started reaching out to old contacts about freelance architecture work, small projects, anything to get my foot back in the door. And I got close a few times. Really close. He paused, his jaw tightening. But every time I got close to landing something, it fell through. A firm in Brooklyn was about to hire me for a community center project. The partner called me 3 days before I was supposed to start and said they'd received some concerning information about my mental health history, that they couldn't take the risk. I didn't have a mental health history, Victoria. I'd never been diagnosed with anything because I'd never gone to therapy like you begged me to. But someone had called them anonymously with detailed stories about my depression, my inability to function, my unreliability. Diane, I said. It wasn't a question. I didn't know for sure at the time, Thomas said. I thought maybe it was you, that maybe you were still angry about the divorce and wanted to make sure I suffered. Diane encouraged that belief. She'd say things like, Victoria always did hold grudges, or I'm sure she didn't mean to hurt you, she just doesn't think about consequences, making me doubt you while pretending to defend you. I would never have done that, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Never. I wanted you to be okay, Thomas. I wanted you to rebuild your life. I know that now, he said. But back then, isolated and desperate and listening to Diane's poison every week, I believed it. And it happened again and again. 3 different job opportunities in 2019 all fell through at the last minute after anonymous phone calls about my mental state. I started to believe maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was too damaged to ever work again. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Diane hadn't just stolen Thomas's money. She'd systematically destroyed every opportunity he had to rebuild, and she'd done it while maintaining her role as his only support system, making him dependent on her for basic survival. Why? I asked. Why would she do this to you? What did she possibly have to gain? Thomas looked at me with something like pity. You really don't know? You never saw how she looked at you? We were sisters, I said helplessly. We weren't always close, but I thought we loved each other. I thought she was happy for my success. She hated you, Thomas said bluntly. She's hated you your entire life. Every accomplishment you had, every success, it was like acid on her skin. And when you divorced me, when you threw away your perfect marriage like it meant nothing, something broke in her. She saw an opportunity to prove she was better than you, that she could save what you'd destroyed, that she could be the good sister, the compassionate one, while you were the cold corporate bitch who abandoned her depressed husband. The words hit me like physical blows. I'd known Diane was competitive growing up. She'd always been sensitive about comparisons, about the way our parents praised my grades and career choices. But I'd thought we'd moved past that as adults. I thought she'd found her own success with her marketing company, her own identity separate from mine. She needed me to fail, Thomas continued, because if I succeeded, if I recovered and built a good life after you left me, then it proved you'd made the right choice, that leaving me was justified. But if she could keep me broken, keep me dependent and desperate, then she could point to me as evidence that you were cruel, that you destroyed a good man and didn't care about the consequences. But she destroyed you herself, I said, unable to comprehend the logic. She's the one who stole your money and sabotaged your jobs. The irony is rich, isn't it? Thomas said with that bitter laugh. She convinced herself she was saving me from you while actively destroying me herself, and I think part of her actually believed it. Diane is very good at justifying her actions, at rewriting reality until she's always the victim, always the hero. I thought about my sister, about the woman I'd known my entire life, always dramatic, always needing attention. I remembered how she'd gotten married and divorced twice, both times with elaborate stories about how her husbands had betrayed her, how she'd start businesses and they'd fail, but it was always someone else's fault. I'd chalked it up to bad luck, to Diane's tendency toward chaos. I'd never considered it might be something darker. When did you end up on the streets? I asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a long moment. 3 years ago, 2022. I'd been hanging on by my fingernails, doing odd jobs under the table, staying in progressively worse apartments as my situation deteriorated. Diane was still visiting, still bringing small amounts of money, still positioning herself as my only friend. I think she liked having that power over me, liked being the one I depended on. He rubbed his face with both hands, and I could see how exhausted he was, not just physically, but spiritually, exhausted from years of surviving. I finally confronted her, he said, about the money, about the phone calls to potential employers. I didn't have proof, but I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew she'd been sabotaging me. She denied everything at first, got angry, turned it around and accused me of being paranoid. But I pushed. I told her I was going to report the investment fraud to the police, that I didn't care about protecting her anymore. What did she do? I asked, dreading the answer. She threatened to tell Sophia and Ethan that I'd been stalking you, Thomas said quietly, that I'd been sending you threatening letters, that you'd had to get a restraining order against me. She had documents, Victoria, forged court papers that looked completely legitimate. She said if I went to the police about the money, she'd make sure the kids believed I was dangerous, that I'd lose them forever. Tears were running down my face now, hot and angry. The kids. She used your own children against you. My children who already barely spoke to me, Thomas said. Sophia had written me off completely after the divorce. She blamed me for falling apart, for not being strong enough to keep the family together. Ethan tried to stay in touch at first, but I pushed him away. I was too ashamed of what I'd become. The thought of them believing I was actually dangerous, actually threatening to you, was more than I could handle. So, you let her win, I said. I disappeared, Thomas corrected. I walked away from the last apartment I could afford, stopped answering the burner phone I'd been using, cut off all contact with Diane and everyone else. I thought if I just vanished, at least I couldn't hurt anyone anymore. At least the kids could remember me as pathetic and depressed instead of dangerous and threatening. Oh, Thomas, I whispered. The streets aren't as bad as you'd think, he said, and there was a strange detachment in his voice. Once you accept that this is your life, once you stop fighting it, there's almost a peace to it. No more bills, no more expectations, no more disappointing people. Just survival, finding food, finding shelter, staying safe, simple problems with simple solutions. That's not peace, I said fiercely. That's giving up. That's letting her win completely. Maybe, Thomas agreed. But you asked how I got here, and that's the answer. Your sister systematically destroyed me over 6 years while pretending to save me. She stole my money, sabotaged my career, isolated me from my children, and threatened to destroy what little reputation I had left if I exposed her. And I let her do it because I was too broken to fight back. I sat there, trying to process everything he'd told me. The scope of Diane's cruelty was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or competition. This was systematic, calculated destruction of another human being, and she'd done it to someone already vulnerable, already suffering. I need to see proof, I said finally. Not because I don't believe you, but because I need evidence before I can confront her. Do you have anything? Anything at all that proves what she did? Thomas looked at me with those tired eyes. I have the fake investment documents she gave me. I kept them. Don't ask me why. Some instinct to hold on to something from before I lost everything. They're in a storage locker I've been keeping with money from panhandling. $40 a month for a 5x5 space with the last remnants of my old life. What else is in there? I asked. Some clothes that don't fit anymore. A box of photos from when the kids were little. My architecture portfolio. And a folder with all the documentation from Diane. The investment papers, the fake statements, copies of emails between us. I couldn't let it go. Even when I had nowhere to sleep, I kept paying for that storage unit because it felt like the last proof that I used to be someone, that I used to matter. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. What's the storage company? I'm paying it off for the next 5 years right now. Victoria, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I interrupted. Give me the information. He recited the details, and I transferred $2,000 to the storage company's payment portal, prepaid for 60 months. Then I called my lawyer, not caring that it was past 8 o'clock at night. Jennifer, it's Victoria Ashford, I said when she answered. I need you to start building a fraud case. I'll send details tomorrow, but I need you to clear your schedule. This is going to be complicated and ugly, and it involves family. I could hear the concern in Jennifer's voice when she agreed. I'd been her client for 12 years. She'd handled my divorce from Thomas, my prenup with Marcus, countless business contracts. She knew I didn't make dramatic requests lightly. There's more, Thomas said after I hung up. Things I haven't told you yet because they involve Sophia and Ethan. My heart clenched. What about them? Diane's been in contact with them regularly, more than you probably know. She's been feeding them stories about both of us for years, telling Sophia that you're a narcissist who destroyed me because I wasn't successful enough, telling Ethan that I'm mentally unstable and you had no choice but to leave. She's been playing them against each other and against us, keeping the family fractured so no one compares notes and figures out her lies. I thought about my relationship with my children over the past 8 years. Sophia had been cold and distant, barely speaking to me beyond superficial pleasantries at holidays. Ethan had been warmer, but there was always tension, always this sense that he was disappointed in me somehow. I'd attributed it to the divorce, to them processing their parents' separation. But if Diane had been whispering poison to them this whole time, shaping their perceptions of both Thomas and me, I need to talk to them, I said. Tonight, right now. Are you sure you're ready for that? Thomas asked gently. Because once you start pulling on this thread, Victoria, your whole life is going to unravel. Everything you thought you knew about the last 8 years, it's all going to come into question. I looked at him across that table in that dingy coffee shop, my ex-husband who I'd loved and abandoned, who'd been systematically destroyed while I built my empire and convinced myself I'd made the right choices. He was right. Opening this door would change everything. My relationship with Diane, with my children, possibly even with Marcus. The comfortable narrative I'd constructed about the divorce and my new life would collapse. But I'd already walked through that door the moment I recognized Thomas on that street corner. "I'm ready," I said. I called Ethan first. He was always the easier one to reach, the one who still answered my calls even if our conversations were strained. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Mom, is everything okay?" His voice was concerned. I rarely called him after 8 at night. "I need you to come to a coffee shop on 47th Street right now," I said, "and I need you to bring your sister. Don't tell her why. Just tell her it's an emergency, and she needs to come. Can you do that for me?" There was a pause. "Mom, what's going on? You're scaring me." "I found your father," I said simply, "and you both need to hear what he has to say." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Ethan's voice came back, shaky and uncertain. "Dad? You found Dad? Please, just come," I said. "Both of you. I'll text you the address. And Ethan, don't call Diane. Don't tell her anything. Promise me." "Why would I call Aunt Diane?" he asked, confused. "Just promise me you won't." Okay, I promise. We'll be there in 30 minutes. I hung up and looked at Thomas. He'd gone pale. "Are you sure about this? Seeing them like this?" He gestured at his worn clothes, his unwashed appearance despite his attempt to clean up. "They need to see," I said firmly. "They need to understand what's been done to you, to all of us." The 30 minutes waiting for the kids felt like hours. Thomas and I didn't talk much. What else was there to say? We'd laid bare 8 years of pain and manipulation. Now we just had to face the consequences together. Sophia walked through the door first, power suit and designer heels, every inch her mother's daughter. Ethan followed, more casually dressed in jeans and a sweater. They both scanned the coffee shop, found me at the back table, and started walking over. I watched the exact moment they recognized the man sitting across from me. Sophia stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand flew to her mouth. Ethan's face went white, then red, emotions flickering too fast to name. They stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity. "Dad?" Ethan finally whispered. Thomas stood up slowly, hands shaking. "Hello, son. Hello, Sophia." Sophia made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Then she was moving, closing the distance between them and throwing her arms around Thomas, despite his dirty clothes, despite the smell of the streets that clung to him. "Oh my God! Oh my God, Dad, what happened to you?" Ethan joined the embrace, and suddenly my ex-husband was surrounded by our children, all 3 of them crying. I stayed in my seat, giving them that moment, tears streaming down my own face. Whatever else had gone wrong, whatever damage had been done, these were still his kids, and they still loved him. After several minutes, they separated. Sophia was staring at Thomas like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Ethan couldn't seem to let go of his father's arm, like he was afraid Thomas would disappear if he stopped touching him. "Sit down," I said quietly. "Both of you. Your father has something to tell you, and you need to hear all of it before you react." They sat, one on each side of Thomas. I watched their faces as he told the story again, starting from the divorce and moving through every betrayal, every manipulation, every cruel act Diane had committed. Sophia's expression went from shock to disbelief to fury. Ethan just kept shaking his head, tears running silently down his face. When Thomas got to the part about the forged restraining order, about Diane's threat to make them believe he was dangerous, Sophia exploded. "That's why you disappeared," she shouted, drawing looks from the other customers. She lowered her voice, but the intensity remained. "I thought you just didn't care anymore. I thought you'd given up on us. Aunt Diane told me you'd moved to California, that you wanted a fresh start away from your old family. I believed her. She told me you were in a treatment facility," Ethan said, his voice hollow, "that you'd had a breakdown and didn't want us to see you like that. She said Mom knew, but was respecting your privacy. I've been asking her for updates for 3 years, and she kept saying you were making progress, but weren't ready for visitors yet." I felt the anger building in my chest like a physical pressure. Diane had lied to all of us, systematically, deliberately, for years. She'd kept us separated, kept us hurting, all while positioning herself as the caring family member who was trying to help. "Where is she now?" Sophia asked, and there was steel in her voice. "Where is Aunt Diane right now?" "Probably at home in Brooklyn," I said. "Why?" Sophia stood up. "Because I'm going to her house right now, and I'm going to make her admit what she did. I'm going to record every word, and then I'm going to destroy her." "Sophia, wait," Thomas said, but she was already heading for the door. Ethan looked torn between following his sister and staying with his father. "Go with her," I told Ethan. "Don't let her do anything that could compromise a legal case. Record everything, but don't make threats. I have a lawyer building a fraud case. We need to be smart about this." Ethan nodded and ran after his sister. Through the window, I watched them get into Sophia's car and speed away. I turned back to Thomas. "This is going to get ugly," I said. "It's been ugly for 8 years," Thomas replied. "At least now it's honest ugly instead of hidden ugly." My phone rang. It was Marcus. I'd forgotten to tell him I wouldn't be home for dinner. I answered. "Where are you?" he asked, irritation clear in his voice. "I've been waiting for you." "We have the Hendersons coming for drinks in an hour." "I'm not coming home tonight," I said. "Cancel with the Hendersons. Something's come up. What could possibly be more important than hosting business associates?" Marcus's voice had that edge it got when things didn't go according to his carefully planned schedule. "I found Thomas," I said. "My ex-husband. He's been homeless for 3 years and my sister is responsible. I'm dealing with a family crisis, Marcus. The Hendersons will have to wait." The silence on the other end was long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Finally, "I see. And how long do you expect this crisis to last?" The coldness in his voice hit me like a slap. This was the man I'd married thinking he was stable and emotionally mature. But now I heard the same thing I'd heard in my own voice 8 years ago when I'd looked at Thomas's depression as an inconvenience rather than an illness. Marcus didn't care about my crisis. He cared that it was disrupting his plans. "As long as it takes," I said. "I'll talk to you later." I hung up before he could respond. Thomas was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's your second husband?" he asked. "Yes. He sounds like a real prize," Thomas said dryly. Despite everything, I almost laughed. He's exactly what I thought I needed. Successful, stable, uncomplicated. No messy emotions to deal with. "No emotions at all from the sound of it," Thomas observed. He was right. And suddenly I understood something I'd been too proud to admit for 8 years. I hadn't married Marcus because I loved him. I'd married him because he was safe, because he would never need me the way Thomas had needed me, would never make me face my own limitations and fears. Marcus and I had a partnership based on mutual benefit and social standing. We didn't have a marriage. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "At Diane's house. She's here, recording everything." "The kids are confronting her now," I told Thomas. He nodded slowly. "Then it's all going to come out. Everything." "Are you ready for that?" I asked. "I've been living in hell for 3 years, Victoria. Whatever comes next can't be worse than that." But I wasn't sure he was right, because sometimes the truth, when it finally emerges, destroys everything in its path, and we were all standing directly in that path now. My phone rang 20 minutes later. It was Sophia, and I could hear shouting in the background before she even spoke. "Mom, you need to come here right now," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Aunt Diane is losing her mind. She's admitting things, denying things, spinning stories. I need you here to hear this. I need you to see what she really is." "I'm coming," I said, already standing. "Keep recording. Don't let her leave." I looked at Thomas. "Do you want to come?" He hesitated, and I could see the fear in his eyes. After 3 years on the streets, the thought of confronting Diane face to face must have been terrifying. But then something shifted in his expression. Something hardened. "Yes," he said. "I want to look her in the eye while she tries to explain what she did." We took a taxi to Diane's brownstone in Brooklyn. I paid the driver, and we stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the house. It was a beautiful building, renovated and expensive. My sister had always lived well, always maintained appearances. I'd never questioned where the money came from, never wondered if her marketing business was really as successful as she claimed, Now I knew at least $340,000 of it had come from destroying Thomas. Sophia opened the door before we could knock. Her face was blotchy from crying, her perfect makeup ruined. Behind her, I could hear Diane's voice, high-pitched and defensive. I didn't do anything wrong. I was trying to help him. You don't understand what it was like watching him fall apart. We walked into the living room. Diane was standing by the fireplace, Ethan positioned between her and the door like he was afraid she'd try to run. When she saw me, her face went pale. When she saw Thomas behind me, she actually stumbled backward. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't be here. You were supposed to stay gone." "Supposed to?" Thomas said, and his voice was eerily calm. "Is that what you thought? That you destroyed me so thoroughly I'd never resurface?" "I didn't destroy you." Diane's voice rose to a shout. "You destroyed yourself. The drinking, the depression, the complete inability to function like a normal person. I tried to help you." "You stole $340,000 from him," I said coldly. "That's not help. That's theft." Diane's eyes darted between all of us, calculating. I could see her trying to figure out how much we knew, what story she could spin that would get her out of this. It was fascinating and horrifying watching her work, seeing the manipulation in real time now that I knew what to look for. "That money was an investment that went bad," she said finally. "I lost money too. I've been trying to pay him back, but he disappeared before I could make it right." "Show her the documents," Thomas said quietly. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos Thomas had texted me from the storage unit. Bank statements showing Diane withdrawing his investment funds directly into her personal accounts. Emails where she'd promised returns that never materialized. Credit card statements showing massive gambling debts paid off within weeks of receiving Thomas's money. Diane's face went from pale to gray as I scrolled through the evidence. "Where did you get those? Those are private." "You gave them to me," Thomas said. "You were so confident I'd never fight back that you got sloppy with your lies. Every fake statement, every forged document, I kept them all. Because somewhere deep down, I think I always knew I'd need proof one day." "The investment fraud is just the beginning," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "Tell her about the jobs, Aunt Diane. Tell her how you called every single employer Dad tried to work for and told them he was mentally unstable." Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "I was protecting them. He was mentally unstable. He could barely get out of bed." "He was depressed," I said, my voice like ice. "He needed treatment, not sabotage. And you made sure he could never get the help he needed because you kept him desperate and dependent on you." "I was the only one who cared about him," Diane screamed. "You threw him away like garbage. You moved on to your rich new husband and your perfect new life, and you never once looked back to see what you'd left behind. I was there. I was the one picking up the pieces, while stealing every penny he had," Ethan said quietly, "while lying to his children about where he was, while forging legal documents to threaten him into silence. That's not love, Aunt Diane. That's not care. That's something sick." Diane turned on him, her face twisted with rage. "You don't understand. You're just a child. You don't know what it's like to live in someone's shadow your entire life. Everything was always about Victoria. Victoria the successful one, Victoria the smart one, Victoria who married the creative architect and had the perfect family. Do you know what it's like watching everyone worship someone while you're just the other sister, the less important one?" "So you decided to destroy her ex-husband to prove what?" I asked. "To prove you were better than me? To prove I'd made a mistake leaving him?" "I was saving him," Diane insisted, but her voice was cracking now. "I was giving him the love and support you never did. I was showing him that someone valued him even if you didn't. By stealing his money and making sure he could never work again," Thomas said. "By threatening to turn his own children against him? That's your version of love?" Diane lunged toward Thomas suddenly, her hands reaching for him. Ethan caught her, holding her back as she screamed, "I loved you! I actually loved you, and you never saw it. You were always so focused on Victoria, on getting her back, on proving yourself worthy of her. I was right there. I was always right there." The room went silent. Even Diane seemed shocked by what she'd just admitted. "Oh my God," Sophia whispered. "You were in love with him. This whole time, you were in love with Dad." Diane crumpled, sliding down to sit on the floor, her back against the wall. "Since the beginning," she said, and now she just sounded tired. Since that first day, he came to design the office, and Victoria brought him to family dinner. He was so passionate, so alive. He talked about buildings like they were poems, and Victoria barely paid attention. She was on her phone half the night, taking work calls. I thought, how could she not see how special he was? I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. You've been in love with my husband for 30 years? Ex-husband, Diane corrected automatically. And yes, I watched you take him for granted for 2 decades, watched you prioritize work over family, watched you get frustrated with him instead of supporting him. When he lost his job and fell apart, I thought finally. Finally, Victoria would show her true colors and leave, and I could be there for him the way he deserved. So you encouraged the divorce, I said slowly, pieces falling into place. You told me I was doing the right thing while telling him I was cruel. You wanted us to separate so you could have him. I wanted to save him from you, Diane said. I wanted to show him what real love looked like, what support looked like. But even after the divorce, even after everything, he still talked about you, still loved you, still wanted you back. Do you have any idea how that felt? Knowing I could never compete with your ghost? So you destroyed him, Thomas said, and his voice was hollow. If you couldn't have me, you'd make sure I was too broken for anyone else to want, including myself. I tried to help you, Diane insisted, but the words sounded hollow even to her now. I tried to make you better, but you wouldn't let go of her. And the gambling, that wasn't about you, that was my own problem. But yes, I used your money to fix it because I thought we'd have time. I thought I could pay you back before you noticed. I thought we'd build a life together and the money wouldn't matter. You thought he'd fall in love with you, Sophia said, disgust clear in her voice. You thought if you just kept him dependent and isolated long enough, he'd turn to you. He did turn to me, Diane shouted. I was all he had. I was the only person in his life. But it was never enough. He never looked at me the way he looked at Victoria. Even homeless, even eating from garbage cans, I'd bet he was still thinking about her. She turned to Thomas, tears streaming down her face. Wasn't I good enough? I gave you everything. I gave you money, food, company. I listened to you for hours. I was there when no one else was. Why wasn't that enough? Thomas looked at her with something like pity. Because it was poisoned, Diane. Every kind word came with manipulation. Every dollar came with strings. You weren't supporting me, you were collecting me. Like a broken toy you wanted to keep on your shelf where no one else could play with it. The forged restraining order, I said suddenly. The threats about making the kids think Thomas was dangerous. That was never about protecting yourself from legal consequences. That was about making sure he could never come back to us. Making sure we'd be afraid of him if he tried. Diane didn't deny it. She just sat there on the floor, makeup running, perfect facade completely shattered. I'm calling the police, Sophia said, pulling out her phone. Wait, I said. Everyone looked at me. Before we do that, I want her to admit it all, on camera. Every crime, every lie, every manipulation. I want a complete confession that will hold up in court. Why would I do that? Diane asked bitterly. So you can destroy me? You destroyed yourself, I said. But yes, I want to watch you face consequences for once in your life. I want you to admit what you did to Thomas, to me, to our children. And if you don't, I'll make sure the evidence we already have puts you in prison for as long as possible. But if you confess everything now, voluntarily, I'll consider asking for a lighter sentence. It was a lie. I had no intention of showing her any mercy, but I needed her confession, needed every detail documented. Diane looked at Thomas. Would it make a difference if I said I was sorry? No, Thomas said simply. Because you're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught. She flinched like he'd struck her, but she didn't deny it. Fine, she said finally. I'll tell you everything. But not because of your threats, Victoria. Because I'm tired. I'm so tired of pretending. Do you know how exhausting it is maintaining this many lies? How much energy it takes to remember who you told what story to? Sophia started recording on her phone. Ethan positioned himself to get a clear view of Diane's face. And for the next 45 minutes, my sister confessed to everything. The investment fraud, the stolen money, the phone calls to employers, the forged documents, the lies to the children, her obsessive love for Thomas and her jealous hatred of me. Every manipulation, every cruelty, every calculated act of destruction. She told us about draining Thomas's investment funds to pay gambling debts totaling over $400,000, about calling his potential employers with detailed stories of violent behavior she'd completely fabricated, about paying a lawyer to create fake restraining order paperwork that looked legitimate enough to terrify Thomas into silence, about telling Sophia that Thomas had abandoned them, telling Ethan that Thomas was institutionalized, telling me that Thomas was better off without contact. She admitted to intercepting emails I'd sent Thomas in the first year after the divorce, messages where I'd asked how he was doing, whether he needed anything. She'd deleted them before he could see them and told him I'd blocked all communication. She admitted to taking money from Thomas's account and telling him it was for investment returns when really it was going to underground poker games and online gambling sites. The more she talked, the more the full scope of her betrayal became clear. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. This was a systematic, years-long campaign of psychological and financial abuse, all motivated by an obsession she'd nursed for 3 decades. When she finally stopped talking, the room was silent except for her ragged breathing. Sophia stopped the recording and immediately uploaded it to a cloud service. Insurance against Diane, trying to destroy the evidence. "Now, can I call the police?" Sophia asked me. I nodded. While Sophia made the call, I walked over to Thomas. He was standing very still, staring at Diane like he was seeing her for the first time. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Part of me feels vindicated. Part of me just feels sad. She wasted so much of her life on hate and obsession. She could have been happy if she'd just let go." "She didn't want to let go," I said. "She wanted to win. And in her mind, winning meant destroying both of us." The police arrived 15 minutes later. We handed over the recording, the documents from Thomas's storage unit, bank statements, everything. The officers listened to our statements, looked at the evidence, and arrested Diane for fraud, forgery, and theft. As they led her out in handcuffs, she looked at me one last time. "You still won't have him," she said. "He'll never forgive you for leaving him." I made sure of that too. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to her. After the police left with Diane, the 4 of us stood in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of her carefully constructed life. Designer furniture, expensive art, everything funded by theft and manipulation. "What happens now?" Ethan asked quietly. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I said. "If that's even possible." Thomas looked at me, and for the first time since I'd found him on that street corner, I saw something other than pain in his eyes. I saw a question. I saw possibility. "Is it possible?" he asked. I thought about Marcus waiting at home, irritated that I'd disrupted his dinner party. I thought about the life I'd built that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow inside. I thought about 8 years of running from guilt and grief and the truth of what I'd done. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'd like to try." 6 months later, my life looked nothing like it had the day I found Thomas on that street corner. Marcus and I divorced within 2 months of that night. He'd given me an ultimatum the morning after Diane's arrest. Either I let go of this obsession with my ex-husband and refocus on our marriage, or he was done. I'd chosen to be done. The divorce was quick and amicable in the way divorces between 2 people who never really loved each other can be. He kept the Connecticut estate. I kept my company and my sanity. We both walked away relieved. Diane was currently serving a 7-year sentence for fraud, theft, and forgery. The judge had been particularly harsh given the calculated nature of her crimes and the vulnerable state of her victim. She'd tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming her gambling addiction and obsessive feelings for Thomas had impaired her judgment. The prosecution had presented her confession, where she detailed every manipulation with cold clarity. That had ended that defense quickly. I visited her once, 3 months into her sentence. I'm still not sure why I went. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I needed to see her actually facing consequences. She looked small in the prison visiting room, her perfect appearance stripped away by an orange jumpsuit and no makeup. We sat across from each other in silence for almost 5 minutes before either of us spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she'd said finally. "Good," I'd replied. "Because I won't." "Do you hate me?" she'd asked. I'd thought about that question seriously before answering. No. I feel sorry for you. You wasted your entire life on jealousy and obsession. You could have built something real, found someone who actually wanted you. Instead, you spent 30 years destroying people who trusted you. That's not hate, I feel. It's pity. She'd flinched like I'd slapped her. Pity was apparently worse than hatred. I'd left without saying goodbye. Thomas was living in a small apartment I'd helped him secure. Not out of obligation or guilt, though those feelings were certainly present, but because it was the right thing to do. He was working with a trauma therapist 3 times a week, processing not just the 3 years on the streets, but the entire decade of manipulation and abuse he'd endured. The progress was slow but real. Some days were better than others. He'd started working again, carefully. Small freelance projects, designing community spaces for nonprofits. He said he didn't want to return to commercial architecture, didn't want to chase prestige or money anymore. He wanted his work to mean something. I'd introduced him to several organizations through my business connections, and word was spreading about his talent and his story. He was building something new from the ashes of what Diane had destroyed. We had dinner together once a week, Thomas and I. Sometimes the kids joined us. Sometimes it was just the two of us. We weren't trying to resurrect our marriage. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done by both of us in different ways. But we were building something else. A friendship, maybe. A partnership in co-parenting adult children who were still processing their own trauma from this situation. A mutual support system of 2 people who understood each other's pain in ways no one else could. Last month, over Thai food at a restaurant near his apartment, Thomas had said something that stuck with me. You know what the worst part was? Not the streets, not the hunger, not even the cold. It was believing that I deserved it, that I'd failed so completely as a human being that living in trash was appropriate. Diane didn't just steal my money and my opportunities. She stole my sense of self-worth. That's what I'm really recovering from now. I stole some of that too, I'd admitted. When I left you, I told myself it was self-preservation. But really, I couldn't handle your imperfection. I'd married you thinking you'd always be the strong, creative, successful man I fell in love with. When you became depressed and unemployed, I saw you as broken. I abandoned you when you needed me most because it was easier than facing my own limitations as a partner. We both made mistakes, Thomas had said gently. The difference is, Diane made choices. She chose to manipulate and destroy. We just failed each other as flawed humans, trying to survive difficult circumstances. I'd appreciated the grace in his words, even if I wasn't sure I deserved it. Sophia had thrown herself into the legal case against Diane with the intensity she brought to everything. She'd helped the prosecutors build their case, tracked down additional victims of Diane's gambling debts and schemes, made sure every detail was documented. I think she needed to do something concrete with her anger. She'd apologized to her father 100 times for believing the worst about him, for cutting him out of her life. He kept telling her she'd been manipulated, that she had nothing to apologize for. I don't think she believed him yet. Ethan had surprised me by taking a leave of absence from his tech startup to spend more time with Thomas. He'd helped his father apartment hunt, furniture shop, navigate the social services available to people recovering from homelessness. They'd rebuilt their relationship through action rather than words. Last week, Thomas had shown me photos of a camping trip they'd taken upstate. Ethan's smile in those photos was the first genuine one I'd seen from him in years. My relationship with my children was slowly improving. Sophia was still angry with me, and maybe she always would be to some degree. But she was talking to me again, really talking, about her feelings and fears and disappointments. Ethan had become a bridge between his sister and me, gently pointing out when Sophia was being too harsh or when I was being too defensive. We were learning how to be honest with each other instead of performing our roles. I'd made major changes to my company as well. I'd promoted my second-in-command to co-CEO and reduced my own hours by half. I'd spent 23 years building an empire, and I was tired. Tired of the constant drive, tired of the need to prove myself, tired of measuring my worth by deals closed and money earned. I wanted to actually live the life I'd built instead of just accumulating more success. Last month, I'd started volunteering at a shelter for homeless families. It was Thomas's suggestion. He'd said I needed to understand what those 3 years had really been like for him. needed to see the faces of people most of society ignored. He was right. Working with those families had changed something in me, had made me realize how close any of us are to losing everything, how much suffering exists just beneath the surface of the successful world I'd inhabited. This morning, I'd met Thomas at the storage unit where he'd kept the remnants of his old life. We'd gone through the boxes together, sorting what to keep and what to finally let go. He'd pulled out his old architecture portfolio, the one that had won him awards and acclaim 20 years ago. He'd flipped through it slowly, looking at designs for buildings that had never been built, dreams that had died with his unemployment. "Do you miss it?" I'd asked. "The success? The recognition?" "Sometimes," he'd admitted, "but not as much as I thought I would." Those accomplishments were real, but they were also tied to an identity that doesn't fit me anymore. I'm building something different now, something smaller, but more meaningful. We'd come across a box of family photos, the four of us at Sophia's college graduation, at Ethan's high school plays, at Christmases and birthdays and ordinary Sundays, a whole life documented in fading prints. We'd looked like a happy family. In many ways, we had been. Before depression and recession and unaddressed mental health issues had torn us apart. Before Diane had exploited our vulnerabilities for her own twisted purposes. "Can I keep some of these?" Thomas had asked. "For my apartment?" "Keep all of them," I'd said. "They're your memories too, your life. She can't take that away from you." Now, sitting in my apartment alone, I thought about that phrase Thomas had used on the street corner 6 months ago. "I tried to save you." At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. How could someone homeless and starving save anyone? But I understood now. He'd tried to save me from becoming someone who valued success over humanity, someone who discarded people when they became inconvenient, someone who built walls so high that nothing real could get through. He'd failed because he'd been drowning himself, couldn't save anyone while he was being destroyed. But his warning had echoed through those 8 years, waiting for the moment when I'd finally be ready to hear it. I hadn't rescued Thomas from that street corner. That encounter had rescued me from a life that looked perfect, but felt empty. From a marriage built on convenience rather than love. From relationships with my children based on performance rather than honesty. From a version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. The cost had been everything I thought defined me. My second marriage, my illusions about my sister, my carefully constructed narrative about the divorce, and my choices. But what I'd gained was the possibility of becoming someone real again, someone flawed and honest and capable of growth. Thomas was right about one thing. Some kinds of saving take a long time. Some rescues require destroying everything you thought you were to discover who you actually could be. The man I'd found eating garbage behind a restaurant had been a mirror showing me my own spiritual homelessness. We'd both been living in prisons of our own making, his visible on the streets, mine hidden behind success and designer clothes. We were both rebuilding now, slowly, painfully, honestly, not toward what we'd been before, but toward something new, something that acknowledged our failures and traumas while refusing to be defined by them. I picked up my phone and texted Thomas. "Dinner this week? I'd like to hear about your new project." He responded immediately. "Thursday at 7? There's a community center I'm designing for homeless youth. I'd love your thoughts on the funding proposal." I smiled. It's a date, not a romantic date. We weren't going there, might never go there again, but a commitment to showing up for each other in ways we hadn't been able to before, to being honest about our limitations while supporting each other's growth, to building something real from the ruins of what we'd lost. 8 years ago, I'd walked away from a marriage I thought was drowning me. 6 months ago, I'd found my ex-husband literally drowning on the streets. Now we were both learning to swim again, separately, but together. Imperfect survivors of disasters both caused and endured, doing our best to build lives worth living. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined for us, but it was honest. And after years of lies and manipulation and self-deception, honesty felt like salvation.